The firebase at Kepler's Reach had no official name on any military map. That was intentional. Forward Operating Base Cinderblock, as the 14th Combined Arms Regiment had taken to calling it, existed in the gap between two interstellar jurisdictions, a rocky shelf of basalt and frozen nitrogen on the moon Vethra 4, where the Galactic Compact's administrative boundary lines dissolved into static and no one technically owned the airspace. It was the kind of place wars happen quietly. The kind of place that never made it into the official casualty reports until someone on the home front started asking too many questions. Staff Sergeant Marcus Lane had been stationed at Cinderblock for 11 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. He knew because he'd been counting. The firebase housed 63 personnel, a mix of human soldiers from the Earth Expeditionary Ground Forces, 2 Vetheri scout liaisons whose biology required heated quarters and hourly glucose supplements, and 1 embedded medic from the Compact's allied Draven species named Field Surgeon Rethkal, who had 4 hands, bioluminescent skin patterns that shifted with her emotional state, and the most unsentimental bedside manner Marcus had ever encountered in any sentient species. She was also, as of 0300 hours on day 328, the only medical personnel still alive. The Hrek offensive had come from the ridgeline. It always came from the ridgeline. That was the thing about the Hrek. Humanities tactical analysts had spent 4 years studying their assault patterns and had identified 17 distinct behavioral signatures. 17 predictable approaches. The Hrek apparently had read the same analysis, because on day 328 they used none of them. They came from below. Through tunnels that shouldn't have existed through 6 meters of basalt, using drilling technology that the Compact's intelligence division had assessed as theoretically possible but economically impractical. The Hrek, it turned out, did not share humanity's definition of practical. In the first 40 minutes, Cinderblock lost its communications array, its eastern defensive perimeter, its motor pool and 29 soldiers. Not to overwhelming numbers, the Hrek assault force was smaller than the firebase's own complement, but to precision. Targeted strikes on command nodes. Surgical elimination of squad leaders. The kind of decapitation strategy that spoke of detailed prior intelligence. Someone had sold them a roster. That question would matter later. Right now, Marcus was bleeding through his second field dressing and trying to reach the medbay with Private First Class Yolanda Chin draped across his shoulders in a fireman's carry while Corporal J1 Park provided suppressing fire from behind an overturned equipment rack that had been rated for cargo transport, not ballistic protection. Ref. Marcus kicked the medbay door open with his boot. 2 incoming, 1 urgent. The Draven surgeon was already working, 3 of her 4 hands occupied with Sergeant Delacroix, whose left side Marcus chose not to examine too closely. Her 4th hand was already reaching for a triage scanner without looking up. Place her on the secondary table. Lane, you're 3rd. I'm functional. You're losing 200 milliliters per hour from your lateral thoracic region and your blood pressure is reading at the lower acceptable threshold for your species. You are not functional. You are mobile. There is a difference. Her skin patterns shifted to a flat gray amber, which Marcus had learned meant focused concentration under stress. I have enough synthetic human blood compound for 1 full transfusion. Delacroix gets it. Chin gets a partial. You get field stabilization and we manage from there. And if there's a 4th? She didn't answer. There was a 4th. And a 5th. By the time the Hrek assault unit was repelled, not destroyed, repelled, pushed back through their own tunnels by 13 surviving soldiers, 2 remotely operated weapons platforms running on backup power, and what Marcus would later describe in his official report as creative application of fire suppression chemicals in an offensive context. The medbay had consumed every unit of synthetic blood compound in its inventory. Reth had performed 6 emergency surgeries in 4 hours. 4 soldiers survived them. 2 did not. Marcus Lane was the 7th case. He'd been hit twice more during the final push. Once in the shoulder, superficial, and once in the lower abdomen, not superficial at all. He'd known he was hit but hadn't registered the severity until the adrenaline metabolized and his legs decided to stop cooperating somewhere near the airlock. Corporal Park had dragged him the rest of the way. Reth met him on the floor of the medbay. She'd run out of functioning tables, and her skin went through 3 color cycles in rapid succession. Marcus had never seen that particular sequence before. That bad? He asked. You have significant internal hemorrhaging. If you were Draven, I could use a coagulation compound that would stabilize you within minutes. She was already working as she spoke, 4 hands moving with the efficient choreography of a surgeon who had stopped letting emotional response slow her down years ago. You are not Draven. Fresh out of human blood? Correct. What about the Vetheri? Could there? Incompatible at the cellular level. It would accelerate the hemorrhaging. She paused. 1 full second. For Rethkal, that was the equivalent of a long, heavy silence. There is one remaining option. I want to be precise about what it involves before I suggest it, because the literature on interspecies emergency transfusion is limited, the risk profile is significant, and the outcome, if you survive, may include biological changes that I cannot fully predict. Marcus looked at the ceiling of the medbay. He could hear the firebase's backup generators cycling. He could hear Park's voice somewhere outside calling a personnel count. He could feel, quite clearly, that he was running out of time to have this conversation. Tell me. Retha's skin shifted to a deep, still blue, a color Marcus had never seen her display before. I am carrying blood, she said. Not Draven blood. I am a field surgeon embedded with a combat unit operating in a contested zone. Before deployment, compact medical protocol requires embedded personnel of certain allied species to carry emergency biological reserves. In my case, she reached beneath the supply cabinet and retrieved a sealed biometric container, narrow and dark, marked with a symbol Marcus didn't recognize. I was assigned a reserve of Vathan blood. The word landed quietly in the recycled air of the medbay. Marcus had heard of the Vathan. Everyone who'd served more than 6 months in compact-adjacent space had heard of the Vathan, though most of what circulated was rumor, half-translated intelligence summaries, and the kind of story soldiers told each other in the dark. An ancient species. One of the founding members of the Compact. Physiologically unlike anything else humanity had catalogued and mostly reclusive, their biology a subject of ongoing classified research by at least 4 separate Compact member species. They were sometimes called, in the informal xenobiological literature, vampiric, though xenobiologists noted that the term was reductive, culturally loaded, and irritating to anyone trying to do serious science. If I do nothing, Reth said, you will likely die within 40 minutes. If I administer this, she held the container steady. Her fourth hand was still managing his wound pressure. You may survive. But Marcus. Her skin pattern stilled. I need you to understand that I do not know what surviving will look like. Marcus closed his eyes for one breath. Then he opened them. Do it. Rethkal did not shake. That was the thing Marcus would remember later, not the cold spreading through his chest from the foreline, not the way the medbay's recycled air suddenly smelled different, sharper, like ozone and old metal, but the fact that in 11 months of watching Reth work, through firefights and decompression incidents and the kind of injuries that made experienced soldiers look away, her hands had never once trembled. They were trembling now. Not visibly, perhaps, to anyone who hadn't spent nearly a year learning to read a Draven surgeon's body language like a secondary language. But Marcus was watching her, and her fourth hand, the one that held the sealed biometric container, was displaying a micro-oscillation that her other 3 hands, occupied with the practicalities of his wound, were not. You've done this before? He asked. No. Has anyone? A pause that lasted exactly as long as it took her to make a decision. There are 3 documented cases in Compact medical literature. 2 Compact species, 1 human, a researcher not military who sustained catastrophic blood loss during a xenobiological survey incident 14 years ago. She was breaking the biometric seal as she spoke, the container responding to her biosignature with a soft depressurization click. The researcher survived. The documentation on long-term outcomes is classified at a tier I do not have access to. That's reassuring. I am a surgeon, not a comfort provider. But her skin flickered briefly to a warm amber, the Draven equivalent, Marcus had learned, of a rueful smile. The immediate mechanism is this. Vathan blood carries a compound their species produces naturally. The closest human language term in xenobiological literature is a biological stabilizer. It is what allows Vathan physiology to function across extreme environmental variations. Cold, low oxygen, radiation exposure that would be fatal to most carbon-based life. The compound essentially convinces surrounding biological tissue to hold its current state rather than deteriorate. So it'll stop the bleeding. It will do considerably more than stop the bleeding. That is the part one cannot fully predict. She held the container up, and in the medbay's emergency lighting Marcus got his first clear look at what was inside. The fluid was dark, not red, not quite black, something between the two that seemed to shift depending on the angle, like oil on water but with an internal quality, a depth, as though it was absorbing the light around it rather than reflecting it. Vathan biology and human biology share approximately 12% of their base molecular architecture. More than most species pairs. Enough that immediate rejection is unlikely. But 12% is not compatibility. It is proximity. What does the other 88% do? That is the question. She attached the administration line with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed the procedure without ever performing it. I will monitor continuously. If your body begins a systemic rejection response, I will attempt to reverse the administration, though at the stage your hemorrhaging has reached, reversal may not be possible in time. Pause. I want to be honest with you. You've been nothing but. I'm giving you a chance. I'm not giving you a guarantee. She looked at him directly, 4 eyes, 2 pairs, the inner set designed for low-light precision, the outer for peripheral threat detection, all 4 currently focused on him with an expression that had no human analog but communicated, across the species barrier, something that felt like genuine care expressed through the discipline of someone who had trained themselves not to let it slow their hands. Are you ready? Marcus thought about the firebase. About the 13 people still alive out there. About the tunnel entrances that would need to be sealed, the communications array that would need to be repaired, the relief force that had been requested and not yet confirmed. About Private Chin on the secondary table, who had stabilized but needed monitoring. About Corporal Park, who was 23 years old and had been at Cinderblock for 2 months and had not volunteered for any of this. I'm ready, he said. The compound entered his bloodstream at 0611 hours, Vethra 4 local time. For the first 90 seconds, nothing happened that Marcus could detect. Then the cold arrived. Not painful, that was the first unexpected thing. He braced for pain the way you brace for a wound being cleaned or a bone being set. Instead it was simply cold, starting from the foresight in his arm and moving inward with an almost methodical quality, like something cataloging him as it traveled, taking inventory. His core temperature, Reth reported without being asked, was dropping. 2 degrees below baseline. Then 3. Is that within the documented range? Continue breathing deliberately. Full respiratory cycles. He breathed. The cold reached his chest and something happened that he would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately, not to the military debriefers who got a carefully edited version, but to himself, in the private accounting that soldiers do when they're trying to understand what happened to them. It felt like his body was being read. Not invaded. Not overwhelmed. Read, the way a diagnostic scanner reads a system, methodically, without judgment. He could feel his heartbeat with unusual clarity, each contraction distinct and deliberate. He could feel the hemorrhaging site in his abdomen and then, incrementally, he could feel it not hemorrhaging, the tissue holding, stabilizing, the compound doing exactly what Reth had described and doing it with a precision that no human medical technology currently possessed. The bleeding stopped at minute 7. Reth confirmed it without expression, but her skin shifted to a pale gold that Marcus recognized as relief. It's working, he said. The immediate crisis is resolving, yes. She did not sound as relieved as her skin suggested. But Marcus, your neurological readings are elevated beyond what hemorrhage recovery explains. Your sensory processing indicators are, she stopped. Rechecked the scanner. Checked it again with a different instrument. Amplified. Amplified how? Your auditory range has expanded by approximately 30% since administration began. Your visual acuity in low-light conditions is, she turned off the medbay's emergency lighting. The room went dark. Or it should have gone dark. Instead, Marcus found that the room had simply changed. The equipment, the walls, Reth herself were all still visible, rendered in a spectrum he had no previous name for, detail-rich and clear and entirely unlike normal human night vision. He could see Reth's skin patterns with perfect clarity in the dark. He could see the micro-oscillation in her fourth hand had stilled. I can see you, he said. I know, she said. I can see your pupils. They have changed. She turned the lights back on. This is consistent with Vathan sensory biology, which operates across a broader electromagnetic spectrum than human baseline. The compound is not simply stabilizing your tissue. It is, she chose her words carefully, interfacing with your biology, expressing certain Vathan characteristics through your existing physiological framework. The silence between them held the weight of everything that implied. How permanent? Marcus asked. Unknown. Does the compact know this is possible? Another pause, longer this time. Her skin went to gray-amber again. Concentration. Or something more complicated than concentration. The classified case file, she said quietly, now makes considerably more sense to me. Outside the med bay, Corporal Park's voice was calling a second personnel count. The firebase's backup generators were still cycling. The tunnel entrances were still unsealed. Marcus sat up. What are you doing? Reth said. Getting back to work. She watched him stand. Watched him move, steadier than he should have been, faster than post-surgical physiology allowed. Watched him pick up his rifle and check the charge without fumbling despite the inadequate light. Marcus. Her voice was quiet. When the others see you, there will be questions. Then I'll answer them. They may not. She stopped. Restarted. How you appear right now. Your eyes. Your reaction time. The others may not respond with simple curiosity. He paused at the door. I know, he said. But we've got tunnels to seal and a relief force to contact, and right now I'm the most functional person in this firebase. He looked back at her, and she saw in his changed eyes something that was still entirely recognizably human: responsibility. We worry about the rest later. He stepped out into the firebase's half-dark, and Reth stood in the medbay doorway and watched him move through it, and began composing in her mind the most carefully worded incident report she had ever written in 15 years of field surgery. Because she was already certain that what had happened in her medbay tonight was not going to stay in her medbay. Corporal J1 Park was 23 years old, 8 months into his first deployment, and had already seen more combat in those 8 months than the Earth Expeditionary Ground Forces recruitment literature had suggested was statistically likely. He had seen soldiers wounded. He had seen soldiers die. He had carried Marcus Lane's bleeding body across 40 meters of contested ground and delivered him to the medbay and then gone back to work because that was what you did, and he was proud of that, quietly, in the way young soldiers learn to carry their own competence without discussing it. He was not prepared for what came out of the medbay. It was Marcus. Structurally, unambiguously Marcus. Same height, same build, same rifle, same worn patch on the left shoulder of his combat jacket from where he'd caught a fragment in the Velhari corridor and had the medics repair the jacket but refused to requisition a new one on some obscure point of unit pride. Park recognized him at 15 meters in poor light without hesitation. But there was something different about how he moved. Park had grown up in a family that kept cats. He knew, from domestic and entirely unglamorous observation, what it looked like when a creature was operating at the full extent of its sensory capability, that quality of attention, of the body orienting toward information rather than simply moving through space. Marcus moved like that now. Not faster exactly. Not differently in any way Park could have specified in a report. Just more present in the space he occupied. More calibrated to it. And then Marcus turned toward him and Park saw his eyes. In the emergency lighting of the firebase's central corridor, human eyes did certain predictable things. They reflected. They caught light at the pupil in a small bright point. They were, optically, limited instruments performing adequately in suboptimal conditions. Marcus's eyes gathered the light and held it. Not glowing, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have looked at home in a horror production. Just wrong, in a precise and uncanny way, the way something appears wrong when it is operating by rules that are similar to the rules you expect but not identical to them. Park's hand moved to his sidearm without conscious decision. He caught it. Stopped himself. Held the hand away from the weapon deliberately and felt embarrassed and couldn't have explained, fully, why the instinct had fired. Sarge, he said. Park. Marcus's voice was the same. That helped. Status on the tunnels? Park reorganized himself. Sergeant Lane was asking a tactical question. That was what mattered. Corporal Ewan and Private Adiz have eyes on tunnel entrance 1 and 2. We don't have the materials to seal them properly. Best we can do is collapse debris placement and we'd need the engineering equipment and that's destroyed in the motor pool, I know. We improvise. Marcus was already moving past him toward the eastern section, checking sight lines with that new quality of attention. What's our comms situation? Array is down. Backup transmitter is functional but we're getting interference that Lieutenant Osei thinks might be HFY jamming rather than equipment damage. Park fell into step beside him because that was habit. Then he said what he needed to say. Sarge. Your eyes. I know. What? Reth will explain the medical details better than I can. Short version. I was dying, she had a Vathan blood reserve for emergency use, it worked, there are side effects. He said it with the flat precision of someone giving a field report, and somehow that was more unsettling than any dramatic delivery would have been. I'm still functional. I'm still me. I need you to take that at face value for approximately the next 6 hours while we get this firebase survivable, and then I'll answer every question anyone has. Park looked at him for a long moment. You're still faster than you should be, he said. Given that you were half dead 20 minutes ago. Yes. Is that the Vathan thing too? Reth thinks so. And that doesn't, Park searched for the word. Concern you? Marcus stopped walking. Turned to face him fully. And Park saw, underneath the wrongness of his eyes, something that was recognizable in the way that mattered. The look of a person who was holding something difficult very carefully, not because they weren't feeling it but because right now was not the time. "It concerns me enormously," Marcus said. "We're going to have that conversation. But I need you to trust me for 6 hours first." Park nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. That was how it started, with Corporal Park choosing trust over instinct, and Marcus Lane moving through the firebase with changed eyes and unchanged purpose while around him the surviving 12 soldiers processed what they were seeing each in their own way. Private Adiz Okoro, who held Entrance 1, saw him coming and went rigid and said nothing for 15 seconds after he'd briefed her and moved on, and then turned back to her post with the focused expression of someone setting a question aside to be answered later. Specialist Tomasz Brzezinski, running the backup transmitter, looked up when Marcus leaned in to assess the jamming interference and then looked very carefully at a point 6 inches to Marcus's left for the rest of the conversation and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of response. Sergeant First Class Diana Reyes, the only other surviving NCO, pulled Marcus aside behind the generator housing and spoke to him quietly and directly in a way that Park, watching from a distance, clearly couldn't hear, and Marcus listened and responded, and at the end of it Reyes nodded once, sharply, with the expression of someone who had asked for a specific thing and received it. Not the thing she'd hoped for, but an honest accounting. Later Park would ask her what she'd said. "I asked him if he was Marcus Lane," Reyes said. "What did he say?" "He said yes, and he said he had proof." She paused. "He said only Marcus Lane would be annoyed that the motor pool got destroyed before he could requisition the replacement battery for his field kit that he'd been requesting for 2 months. And that only Marcus Lane would tell me that right now while we're dealing with everything else, because I'd asked and he takes his answers seriously." Park thought about that. "Did it work?" he asked. "Well, I didn't shoot him," Reyes said. The 6 hours passed in the organized urgency of post-engagement stabilization. Debris placement over the tunnel entrances, casualty accounting, equipment salvage, the methodical rebuilding of defensive capacity with reduced personnel and depleted supplies. Marcus worked through all of it, and the surviving soldiers worked alongside him, and the unspoken agreement held. Questions later, survival now. What none of them saw, because it happened in the shadows at the edge of the firebase where the sensor coverage had gaps, and because everyone was focused on their assigned tasks, was Marcus Lane standing very still at the perimeter wall at hour 4, staring out across the basalt plain and hearing something. Not with his ears. Or not only with his ears. Something in the expanded sensory range that the Vathan compound had opened was receiving information from the darkness outside the wall. Movement patterns, thermal signatures, the subsonic vibrations of things traveling through frozen ground, and his brain was doing something it hadn't been able to do before. Integrating all of it into a coherent picture. There was something out there. Moving through the tunnels again. Not in the numbers of the initial assault. 3, maybe 4. Moving slowly. Not an attack, a reconnaissance. The HFY were confirming the firebase's reduced capability. Marcus considered this for a moment. Then he made a decision that, later, military analysts would spend considerable time debating. He didn't report it through the chain of command. He walked to where Corporal Park was working on debris placement at Entrance 2, crouched beside him and said very quietly, "There's a HFY scout unit in the tunnels. 3 to 4. They'll surface at Entrance 1 in approximately 4 minutes. Park looked at him. "How do you know that?" Marcus had no answer that would have made sense 6 hours ago. "Trust me for 4 more minutes," he said. Park held his gaze for a moment. Then he reached for his radio. The relief force arrived at Cinder Block at 1430 hours, 14 hours after the HFY assault began. 40 soldiers, 2 combat medics, a field engineer team, and a compact liaison officer named Subcommander Vithyral of the Compact Oversight Division. A bureaucratic designation that everyone in the Earth Expeditionary Ground Forces understood meant intelligence, regardless of what it said on the organizational chart. Captain Renata Solis, commanding the relief column, had been briefed on the firebase's casualty figures during the approach. 29 dead in the initial assault. 2 more lost in surgery. 13 survivors, including the embedded Draven field surgeon. What the briefing had not covered, because the survivors' initial radio contact, once the HFY jamming was cleared, had been focused on tactical status and resupply requirements, was the condition of one of those 13 survivors. Solis saw Marcus Lane for the first time when she came through the eastern entrance, and she stopped walking for a fraction of a second that she would later claim, if asked, was simply her assessing the defensive layout. He was helping 2 engineers clear debris from the tunnel entrance. He looked healthy, more than healthy in fact, given that the surgeon's preliminary report indicated he'd been in critical condition during the assault. He moved with the same uncanny quality that Park had noted, that attentiveness, that calibration. And his eyes, in the sharp light of Vethra Ivy's midday sun, were unmistakably not baseline human. She approached him directly. "Staff Sergeant Lane." "Captain." He straightened. Completely normal in posture, voice, address. "The north tunnel is clear. We placed debris collapse at 6 meters depth. It'll hold against foot traffic but won't stop drilling equipment. You'll want the engineer team to assess proper sealing options." "Noted." She looked at him steadily. "We'll do a full tactical debrief at 1600. Medical assessment at 1500. You're first on the medical roster." "Understood." The medical assessment lasted 2 hours. The 2 combat medics, working alongside Rethkal, ran every diagnostic available in their field kit and several that Reth supplemented from her own equipment. They were professional throughout and thorough, and neither of them said anything inappropriate, but both of them independently requested a private consultation with Subcommander Vithyrol before the debrief, which Marcus noted and did not comment on. Vithyrol was compact species, specifically Korath, a species humanity had been working alongside for 6 years, notable for their formidable institutional memory and their tendency to approach every situation as though it were a document that needed to be filed correctly. She was tall, gray-skinned, methodical, and she came to the debrief room 40 minutes early and sat with her recording equipment arranged with geometric precision on the table. Marcus came in and sat across from her, and Reyes took the seat beside him as his unit NCO, and Captain Solis sat at the head of the table, and Rethkal stood near the wall with her 4 hands in the neutral position that meant she was being professionally careful about what her skin colors expressed. "Let's start at the beginning," Solis said. They went through it chronologically. The assault, the casualties, the counteraction, the medbay decisions. Marcus gave his account in the flat, precise register of a soldier making an official report, and Reth corroborated the medical details, and Reyes provided the external perspective. Vithyrol's recording equipment ran throughout, and she asked clarifying questions at precise intervals, and her expression gave nothing away until approximately the 40-minute mark, when Marcus described Park's 4-minute warning and the interception of the Hrek scout unit. She asked him to repeat that portion. He did. "And the information about the scout unit's location," she said, "came from enhanced sensory processing resulting from the transfusion." "That's my best understanding, yes." "You detected subsonic vibration through the ground. Through your feet. And through other inputs that I'm still calibrating. It wasn't a single channel. It was more like a convergence. Multiple information streams integrating simultaneously." He paused. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds," Vithyrol said carefully, "like a functional description of Vathan sensory processing." She looked at Ref. "Field surgeon. The classified case file you referenced, the researcher 14 years ago. Were you briefed on the long-term outcome?" "I do not have access to that tier," Reth said. "I do." Vithyrol held the pause with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much weight it carried. "The researcher lived for 11 more years after the emergency transfusion. She died of causes unrelated to the procedure. During those 11 years she underwent 18 months of documented neurological integration, her brain's existing architecture adapting to process the expanded input range." She folded her hands on the table. She reported no subjective degradation of identity or personality. Her cognitive function increased in certain measurable categories. She was, by her own account and independent assessment, still herself. "And the physical changes?" Reyes asked. "Stabilized after approximately 3 months. The enhanced sensory range became permanent. The accelerated tissue repair, which Sergeant Lane appears to be currently experiencing, was documented in the researcher as well and remained at approximately 40% above human baseline for the duration of her life." The room held that information for a moment. Marcus was looking at the table. When he looked up, his changed eyes were steady and expressionless. "And who classified the file?" "Compact Oversight with Earth Expeditionary Forces co-signature." Vithyrol tilted her head slightly. "Specifically, the classification was applied because the Vathan themselves requested it. They do not discuss their biology openly. The blood reserve that Field Surgeon Rethkal was carrying was allocated for exactly the scenario that occurred, emergency cross-species application, but the Vathan's preference is that outcomes not be formally documented in accessible records." "Why?" She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a question you would need to ask them directly. And that is a conversation that, to my knowledge, no human has had before. She made a precise adjustment to her recording equipment. Sergeant Lane, I need to inform you that this debrief will be classified at the same tier as the previous file. Specific elements of your medical status will be reported to Earth Expeditionary Medical Command, but the nature of those elements will be transmitted in restricted format. You're classifying what I am. I am classifying the mechanism, she said with careful distinction. What you are is a staff sergeant in the Earth Expeditionary Ground Forces who performed under extreme conditions and kept a firebase functional when it had every reason to fail. That is not classified. That is, frankly, the part that should be reported widely. She looked at Solis. Captain, my recommendation is that Sergeant Lane be medically evacuated to an Expeditionary Forces Advanced Medical Facility for comprehensive assessment, and that he be accompanied by Field Surgeon Rethkal, who has the most immediate observational data. Agreed, Solis said. She looked at Marcus. You'll be transport ready by 0600 tomorrow. The firebase. The firebase has 40 soldiers and a full engineer team. The firebase is fine. Her voice carried the complete firmness of someone closing an argument before it started. You've done your job here, Sergeant. Now you're someone else's job. After the debrief, Park found Marcus at the perimeter wall again, in the same spot where he'd stood the previous night. You okay? Park asked. Marcus thought about the debrief. About Vithiral's careful words. About the classified researcher who had lived 11 more years and remained, by all accounts, herself. I will be, he said. That's not the same as okay. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. He looked out across the basalt plain, and whatever his changed eyes were receiving from the darkness, he kept to himself for now. But it's honest. Park stood beside him for a while without speaking, which was, Marcus thought, exactly what was needed. Admiral Priya Chandrasekaran had commanded the Earth Expeditionary Forces Outer Systems Division for 3 years, and in that time she had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between intelligence that was merely sensitive and intelligence that was genuinely dangerous. The restricted transmission from Subcommander Vithiral reached her office on Compact Station Helix at 0200 station time, which meant someone had flagged it for immediate routing regardless of hour, which meant someone, likely Vithiral herself, who did not flag things without reason, considered it urgent. She read it twice. Then she called Director Liaison Null of the Compact Species Relations Directorate and asked, with the particular tone of someone who intends to be very polite precisely because they are genuinely angry, for an immediate meeting. They met in the neutral conference room on level 4, the one with the table large enough for 6 species to sit at simultaneously and the air composition system that could be adjusted in real time, because everyone who used this room regularly had learned that difficult conversations went worse when someone was mildly hypoxic. Director Liaison Null was Vitharii, which was relevant because the 2 Vitharii scout liaisons at Cinderblock were technically under Compact Directorate jurisdiction, which meant Null's office had received Vithiral's transmission simultaneously with Chandrasekaran's and had been expecting this meeting. Null was already seated when Chandrasekaran arrived. Beside him sat a legal observer from the Compact Judiciary, which told Chandrasekaran everything she needed to know about how the Compact intended to approach this conversation. She sat down and did not ask for a moment to prepare. 14 years, she said. Admiral? I'm not starting with anger, I'm starting with a fact. The documented case of cross-species Vathan blood application occurred 14 years ago, the outcome was assessed, and the Earth Expeditionary Forces were party to the co-signature on the classification. I want to understand what we agreed to keep quiet and who in my chain of command agreed to it. Null folded his hands. Vitharii had 4-fingered hands, and the gesture of interlacing them fully was a formality signal, equivalent to clearing a throat before a prepared statement. The co-signature was applied at a diplomatic level, Admiral. The Earth Expeditionary Forces signatory was the then Director of Compact Affairs, who is no longer in that position. The agreement was that the case would remain classified pending a formal joint review of cross-species biological emergency protocols, which was scheduled and then deferred 3 times due to the Hrek conflict escalation. Deferred? Chandrasekaran said. Deferred. So the protocol review that would have resulted in your field surgeons being properly briefed, and ours, was deferred 3 times over 14 years while your field surgeons continued to carry Vathan blood reserves. Pause. Yes. And now I have a staff sergeant who has had a biological transformation that your own classified file documents in one prior case, who has not been told what the full 14-year trajectory of that transformation looks like, because the detailed follow-up data is classified at a tier that even your field surgeon in the situation didn't have access to. She said it all without raising her voice. Director, I am trying very hard to approach this as an administrative failure rather than a betrayal of trust. Please help me maintain that framing by giving me something to work with. Nal spoke with the legal observer for 30 seconds in rapid Vithariae, then turned back to her. The compact is prepared to authorize full declassification of the prior case file to Earth Expeditionary Medical Command, with the understanding that Sergeant Lane's case will be jointly managed by a combined human compact medical team and that all data generated by his case will be shared bilaterally. That's the minimum, Chandrasekharan said. What else? And the compact will formally request that the Vathan Collective open direct consultation with Earth Expeditionary Medical Command regarding the long-term biological profile of the compound. He paused. I want to be honest with you, Admiral. The Vathan's cooperation is not guaranteed. The compact cannot compel it. What we can do is make the request through official channels with the full weight of compact diplomatic protocol. Chandrasekharan looked at him for a long moment. The Vathan, she said. What do we actually know about them? Not the public summary. Not the diplomatic briefing package. What do we know? Another consultation with the legal observer, longer this time. They are the oldest continuously extant species in the compact, Nal said finally. Their founding membership predates the current compact charter by approximately 600 years. Their biology is unlike any other compact member species in several fundamental respects. They do not reproduce in ways that other compact species understand, and they have declined to explain their reproductive biology to any external researcher. They are physically robust to a degree that existing xenobiological models do not fully explain. And they have, on 3 separate occasions in compact history, intervened in large-scale conflicts in ways that resolved those conflicts decisively, and then withdrawn from public involvement without explanation. 3 times in 600 years. Yes. And each of those interventions, was humanity on the right side of them? Nal looked at her steadily. Humanity was not a compact member during any of the 3 interventions. Chandrasekharan absorbed this. So we have no relationship with them. You have one staff sergeant, Nal said quietly, who is currently carrying their biology. The legal observer said something in Vithariae. Nal nodded, then translated. My colleague wishes me to note that this is, depending on how it is managed, either a significant diplomatic complication or a significant diplomatic opportunity. The distinction lies entirely in how Sergeant Lane, your command, and the compact's medical team handle the coming months. Chandrasekharan thought about Marcus Lane, whom she had not yet met. She had read his file on the transport from her quarters to this meeting. 11 months at a forward firebase, exemplary service record. No incidents of note beyond a commendation for the Velhari corridor engagement. The kind of file that described a reliable and capable soldier who had not volunteered for anything extraordinary. He hadn't volunteered for this either. Get me a direct line to the senior Vathan diplomatic contact, she said. Whatever channel exists. And I want Sergeant Lane at Helix Station within 72 hours. She stood. And, Director, the protocol review that was deferred 3 times. It starts again. Today. Undeferrable. Nal inclined his head. Agreed. She walked out of the neutral conference room into the corridor and stood for a moment, thinking about a researcher who had lived 11 more years and by all accounts remained herself, and a staff sergeant who had heard Hrek scouts through frozen ground, and an ancient species that had carried out 3 decisive interventions in 600 years of compact history and then gone quiet. She wondered what they were waiting for. Helix Station was the compact's largest neutral administrative hub in the outer systems. A structure that had been under continuous expansion for 200 years and showed its architecture a layered record of different eras of compact construction philosophy, older sections with their curved organic geometries giving way to more recent angular efficiency, corridors where 6 species' ambient environmental requirements had been negotiated into a single tolerable compromise of temperature. An atmosphere and light. Marcus arrived on the 3rd day after the debrief. He was given quarters in the medical wing, comfortable, well-resourced, monitored without apology. The combined human compact medical team began their assessment on the first morning. 12 practitioners for human, 8 from various compact species, led on the human side by Dr. Emmeline Faber, a neurobiologist from the Earth Expeditionary Force's Advanced Research Division, and on the compact side by a Dravan physician named Orthex Quayle who had 20 years of xenobiological research and the manner of someone who had spent those 20 years being more interested in questions than answers. The assessment was thorough and largely non-invasive and took 4 days. Marcus cooperated fully, which was noted in the official record with a specificity that suggested it was not taken for granted. What the assessment found, catalogued in clinical language across 47 pages of preliminary results, was this. His visual processing had reorganized to incorporate electromagnetic input across a range approximately 2.5 times broader than human baseline. The relevant neural architecture had not been created, it had been repurposed. Existing structures in his visual cortex that had previously processed peripheral and depth information were now handling the expanded input range, suggesting the Vathan compound had identified available processing capacity and reallocated it, rather than building new structures. His auditory range had expanded by 31% at the upper frequency threshold and by an unexpectedly significant 19% at the lower, which explained the subsonic ground vibration sensitivity that had given him the 4-minute warning on Vethra 4. His tissue repair rate was elevated by 38% over human baseline, close to the 40% documented in the previous case. The mechanism appeared to be a sustained low-level activity of the Vathan compound, which had not fully metabolized and gave every indication of not intending to. His cognitive processing speed in tasks requiring simultaneous integration of multiple input streams, tested at a level that Dr. Faber described in her notes as outside the current benchmarking parameters for human cognitive assessment, and then, in a second note appended to the first, described as requiring new parameters. He was still, in every psychological assessment the team could apply, Marcus Lane. He found that fact more reassuring than he expected and less reassuring than he needed. On the 5th day, Rethkal came to his quarters in the evening. She was still at Helix Station, technically on medical leave while the joint team processed her field records, practically hovering near the situation because she was constitutionally unable to begin something and walk away before it was resolved. "How are you?" she said. Not a question exactly. A Draven assessment request. "Functional," he said. "That is not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. Through the viewport in his quarters, Helix Station's exterior was visible. Docking arms extended toward 3 vessels, one of which was an Earth expeditionary supply ship, the other 2 compact designs he could now see in more detail than he'd previously been able to, their hull registration markings readable at a distance that should have been too great. "I keep noticing things," he said. "Things I shouldn't be able to notice. There's a maintenance crew on the exterior hull of that freighter. 3 of them I can tell from the vibration pattern of their tools. I know the crew rotation schedule for this wing of the station because I can hear the shift change conversations through the wall." He paused. "I'm not trying to gather this information. It's just arriving. You are adapting to a new sensory bandwidth," Reth said. "Your brain is learning to filter. That takes time." The researcher, in the classified file. Did she go through this? Reth had now read the full file. She was quiet for a moment. Yes. She described approximately 6 weeks of, she used the term, overwhelming clarity. After that, her brain's filtering mechanisms caught up with the input range, and she learned to modulate it voluntarily. To narrow her focus or expand it depending on what the situation required. Like a skill. Exactly like a skill. Retha's skin settled to a steady warm gold. She also reported, near the end of the documented interview period, that she found it difficult to imagine returning to her previous sensory experience. That the expanded range had become simply hers. Marcus looked at the freighter. He could hear, very faintly, the tool vibrations of 3 maintenance workers and the distant thrum of the station's own structural members, and beneath all of it, something else. A sound that had been at the edge of his perception since he'd arrived at Helix Station. Deep and structured and patient, like a signal waiting to be recognized. He'd been assuming it was mechanical. He was no longer certain. He was about to say something to Reth about it when his door comm activated. Admiral Chandrasekharan's office, requesting his presence immediately. He looked at Reth. Her skin went to a pale, still blue, the same color it had been in the med bay when she'd reached for the container. "Go," she said. The Admiral's briefing room on Helix Station was crowded in a way that the space did not accommodate gracefully. Chandrasekharan at the head of the table, Director Liaison Nal beside her, 2 members of the joint medical team, Subcommander Vithyral in the corner with her recording equipment, and visible on a communications panel at the far end of the room, a representative of a species Marcus had never seen before. The Vathan representative was present via transmission, not in person. The transmission itself was unusual, not standard video, not holographic projection, but something the communication system was apparently rendering in the closest available format, which resulted in an image that was clear in some respects and indeterminate in others, as though certain aspects of the Vathan's physical form were not translating cleanly through the medium. What came through clearly, tall. Dark adapted in a way that the transmission's light calibration was struggling with. Eyes that Marcus recognized, with a sensation that was not quite disorienting but was certainly notable, as operating on a similar expanded spectrum to his own. "Sergeant Lane," Chandrasekharan said. "Thank you for coming quickly. I want to be direct about the situation." She gestured toward the transmission. "The Vathan Collective made contact with Helix Station approximately 3 hours ago. They requested a specific conversation. It is addressed to you." Marcus looked at the Vathan representative. The representative looked back at him. When they spoke, the translation system rendered their voice in a register that sat at the lower edge of Marcus's new auditory range, and for the first time since Vethra 4, the deep structured sound he'd been hearing at the edge of his perception resolved into something intelligible. "We have been observing your recovery," the representative said, and the translation was smooth and formal and entirely inadequate to convey the quality of their voice, which was not simply sound but something his expanded processing range was receiving on multiple channels simultaneously. "Your adaptation is proceeding normally. Your biology is compatible in ways that are statistically rare." "How rare?" Marcus asked. "In our experience, which covers a considerable span of time, we have encountered 3 species whose biology has this level of compatibility with the Vathan compound. Your species is the 4th. The room was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Chandrasekharan asked with careful precision. "It means," the representative said, "that the emergency application in your soldier was not an anomaly. It means the compatibility is species-wide, not individual." Pause. "We would like to discuss what that means. For your species, for the current conflict with the HFY, and for a more formal relationship with humanity than the one that currently exists." Marcus was looking at the representative. He was receiving, through his changed sensory apparatus, information about them that he couldn't yet fully interpret. Layers of signal beneath the voice, beneath the translated words, that he sensed were communicating something in a register he hadn't yet developed the vocabulary for. But he could tell quite clearly one thing. They were not surprised he was here. They had been waiting for this conversation. He didn't yet know how long. The conversation with the Vathan representative lasted 4 hours. Marcus Lane was present for all of it. Admiral Chandrasekharan was present for all of it. Director Liaison Nal was present for most of it and excused himself for one portion. The 3rd hour, after the Vathan representative indicated, with complete politeness, that certain parts of the conversation were intended for the human delegation specifically. Nal excused himself without objection, and his expression as he did so was one that Marcus would remember, not offended exactly but recalibrating. The expression of someone updating a model. The Vathan representative's name, as best as the translation system could render it, was something like Ethon, a compressed approximation of a designation that operated on more channels than spoken language, which the representative acknowledged with dry pragmatism. "It is a useful simplification. We do not object to it." What Ethon told them, across 4 hours, organized itself in Marcus's mind into 3 sections. The first section was history. The Vathan Collective had been compact members for 600 years. Before that, they had been present in this region of the galaxy for considerably longer. The figure Ethon gave was not a number but a description. Before your star had its current configuration of orbital bodies. They had watched species rise and collapse and, in some cases, guided things quietly in directions that prevented unnecessary endings. The 3 interventions in compact history that Nal had referenced were, Ethon noted with the precision of someone correcting a significant undercount, not 3. The documented 3 were simply the 3 that had required overt action. The others had been quieter. The second section was biology. The Vathan compound, the thing in Marcus's blood that had saved his life and changed his sensory architecture, was, in their own description, a form of biological inheritance mechanism. Their species had developed it across millions of years of environmental adaptation, and it was capable, under certain conditions of cellular compatibility, of expressing itself in host biology. Not overriding it. Expressing through it. The 3 prior compatible species were still in existence. 2 were compact members, 1 was independent. All 3 had undergone the same process as Marcus. All 3, Ethon said, had found it, eventually after the adaptation period, to be useful. The Vathan did not say they had designed the compatibility. But they did not say they hadn't. "You've been watching humanity," Chandrasekharan said. Not accusatory. Assessing. "We watch everyone," Ethon said. "We watch with more interest when we believe something significant is possible." "How long have you been watching humanity?" "Since your first extrasolar transit. 87 years by your calendar." Pause. "You are an unusual species. Not in the ways you often tell yourselves, not in aggression or creativity, both of which are common. In something more specific. What? Chandrasekharan asked. Ethan looked at Marcus. You adapt, Ethan said, without losing your character. Most species, when their biology changes, take generations to stabilize their cultural identity. You do it individually. In real time. The representative's transmission flickered slightly, not a technical issue, Marcus sensed, but a deliberate modulation, a Vathan equivalent of emphasis. Sergeant Lane received a biological transformation that, in 3 other documented cross-species applications, required extended isolation periods for psychological stabilization. He was operational within 6 hours. Not because he wasn't affected. Because he decided to be operational and his sense of self was sufficiently stable to accommodate the decision. You were watching Cinder Block, Marcus said. We were aware of the situation, yes. Was it a test? The room tensed. Chandrasekharan held completely still. Ethan's response came after a pause that Marcus, with his changed perceptions, could feel had weight and deliberateness. It was not engineered. Field Surgeon Rethkal carried the reserve by compact protocol. That protocol was established without Vathan involvement in the specific decision. But when the situation developed as it did, a pause. We observed. And Sergeant Lane confirmed what the compatibility data suggested. Your biology is capable of the interface. And your character is capable of managing it. The third section was the offer. The HFY conflict had been escalating for 4 years. The Compact's military capacity was substantial but not unlimited, and the HFY's tunnel warfare technology, their intelligence penetration of Compact assets, and their willingness to accept casualties that Compact species were not willing to match had created a sustained attritional disadvantage. The Compact was not losing the war. But it was not winning it either. The Vathan had intervened in 3 prior Compact conflicts. On each occasion, their intervention had been decisive and their withdrawal had been complete. They did not occupy. They did not govern. They did not remain. What they were proposing now was different. Not intervention, partnership. A formal bilateral agreement between the Vathan collective and Earth's governing bodies, operating outside standard Compact frameworks, which would involve access to Vathan biological technology, sensory augmentation for volunteer military personnel, and, the weight of this particular point was considerable, Vathan direct involvement in HFY strategic assessment. The Vathan, Ethan explained, had been watching the HFY for considerably longer than the Compact had. They knew where the tunnels went. The offer was not unlimited. It was not unconditional. There were requirements on humanity's side. Transparency about deployment, limitations on the scope of biological applications, a commitment to joint research governance. The Vathan were not offering a weapon. They were offering an alliance with a species that had been deciding very carefully for 87 years, whether humanity was worth making one with. When Ethan finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Chandrasekharan looked at Marcus. It was, he recognized, not a command decision. She was looking at him because he was the person in the room who had the most immediate personal stake in what was being offered, and because she was, underneath the rank and the responsibility, someone who believed that mattered. Sergeant Lane, she said. You've been living with this for 5 days. You're the only human being with direct experience of what this involves. I'm not asking you to make the decision. That's above both our pay grades. I'm asking what you think. Marcus looked at the transmission panel. At Ethan, whose eyes operated on a spectrum he now shared. He thought about Cinder Block. About 29 dead in 40 minutes. About the tunnel technology that shouldn't have existed. About Corporal Park, 23 years old, who had chosen trust over instinct and been right to. He thought about the researcher who had lived 11 more years and remained herself. He thought about what it had felt like in the med bay when Retha's compound had traveled through him like something reading him, not invading, not overriding, but finding what was there and working with it. He thought about what Ethan had said, you adapt without losing your character. I think, he said carefully, that humanity has been making contact with species that are stronger, older, or more advanced than us since the first transit, and we have survived every one of those contacts by doing 2 things. We take it seriously, and we stay ourselves. He looked at Chandrasekharan. This is the most serious contact we've had, and we're still ourselves. He paused. I think we should take the meeting. 6 weeks later, the formal delegation between Earth's Governing Council and the Vathan Collective met for the first time in physical space. On a neutral station, chosen by mutual agreement, at a table large enough for species that had been watching each other from a careful distance for nearly a century. Marcus Lane attended as a military technical advisor. His role in the proceedings was limited by design and by his own preference. He sat at the edge of the room and listened, and because his hearing now operated at a range that no one else in the room fully shared, he heard things in the margins of the conversation that he would compile later into a report for Chandrasekharan, subtle informational content in the Vathan communication style, layers of signal beneath the translated words that the room's official interpreters weren't fully capturing. He had started, in the 6 weeks since Helix Station, to develop a vocabulary for it. He was still Marcus Lane. The medical team confirmed it on a weekly basis, and he confirmed it himself in the private accounting that soldiers do, the check-in against one's own character that requires honesty above everything else. But he was also, now, something that no baseline human had been before. A person who existed at the intersection of two biologies, who could hear what the Vathan said beneath their words and see what was visible at the edges of the spectrum, and who had arrived at that position not through design or ambition but through a decision made on a med bay floor on a frozen moon while bleeding out, the decision to survive, and to deal with what survival meant afterward. Rethkal was also at the delegation. She had requested transfer to the Joint Medical Research Team and been approved. She came and found Marcus during the first break in proceedings and stood beside him in the way she had on Cinderblock, efficient, present, professionally careful about her skin colors in public settings. "How is it?" she asked. He considered the room, the Vathan delegation, 3 members, who were receiving him in their sensory range and acknowledging it in the subtle signal layers beneath their formal composure. The human delegation, earnest and prepared and somewhat overwhelmed and doing what the species apparently did, adapting in real time without losing themselves. "Complex," he said. "That is honest. You taught me that." Her skin shifted to warm gold, briefly, before professional discipline reasserted. "What happens next?" Marcus looked at the table where, for the first time in 87 years of observation, humanity and the Vathan were occupying the same room as something more than watcher and watched. "I think," he said, "that's the part none of us know yet." He found, to his own moderate surprise, that he was all right with that.